There are moments in a soldier's life when duty demands the unthinkable, when the oath you swore, the uniform you wear, and the crown you serve all converge into a single, irreversible action. This is the story of one such moment. A moment when a royal guard, bound by centuries of protocol and tradition, was forced to cross a line that should never be crossed. What he discovered behind that wardrobe door would shake the very foundations of the palace, expose secrets buried in silk and shadow, and remind us all that sometimes the greatest act of loyalty is the one that feels like betrayal. It was a Tuesday morning in late September when Sergeant James Thornhill received the order that would change everything. 23 years he'd served in the household division. 23 years of standing perfectly still while tourists took photographs. 23 years of maintaining composure under the weight of a bearskin hat in the scorching summer heat. 23 years of absolute, unwavering discipline. He knew the rules. He knew the boundaries. He knew that certain doors, certain rooms, certain spaces within the palace were sacred, untouchable, forbidden. But on this particular morning, none of that mattered. The call came directly from the Lord Chamberlain's office, not through the usual chain of command, not through his commanding officer, direct, urgent, classified. Sergeant Thornhill had been in service long enough to know that when protocol is bypassed, something is very, very wrong. He stood at attention in the corridor outside the administrative wing, his scarlet tunic pressed to perfection, his boots gleaming like black mirrors, his expression revealing nothing of the storm brewing inside his mind. Sergeant Thornhill. The voice belonged to Sir Michael Ashworth, the Lord Chamberlain himself, a man who'd served 3 monarchs, a man whose word was law within these walls. What I'm about to tell you does not leave this room. What I'm about to ask of you violates every instinct you have as a guardsman, but it must be done, and it must be done now. James felt his jaw tighten. In the military, you learn to read between the lines. You learn to hear what isn't being said, and what he was hearing now was fear, not the fear of physical danger, something worse, the fear of scandal, the fear of truth. There's been an incident, Sir Michael continued, his weathered face grave. Queen Camilla's private quarters, her wardrobe specifically. We have reason to believe that an item of significant historical importance has been misplaced, or perhaps taken. We need absolute discretion. We need someone who understands duty above all else. We need you to conduct a search. The weight of those words settled over James like a cloak made of lead. Search the Queen Consort's private wardrobe. Enter her personal chambers. Touch her belongings. It went against everything. Every protocol, every tradition, every unspoken rule that governed life within these ancient walls. A royal guard does not intrude. A royal guard does not question. A royal guard stands watch, protects, serves, but never ever crosses that invisible line between duty and invasion. But orders are orders, and when the Lord Chamberlain himself issues a command, you don't ask questions. You don't hesitate. You simply obey. Understood, sir, James replied, his voice steady, though his heart hammered against his ribcage like a prisoner against cell bars. Sir Michael handed him a key. Heavy. Old. The kind of key that opens doors meant to stay closed. You have 1 hour. The Queen Consort is attending a charity luncheon in Kensington. Her staff has been temporarily reassigned. You'll be alone. Find what we're looking for, report back, and speak of this to no one. Not your wife, not your fellow guardsmen, not even your commanding officer. This is a matter of crown security. Crown security. The phrase that justifies everything. The phrase that turns wrong into right, illegal into necessary, impossible into mandatory. James took the key. It was warm, as though it had been clutched in someone's anxious hand for too long. He saluted, performed a precise about-face, and marched toward a destiny he neither wanted nor could avoid. The walk to Queen Camilla's private chambers felt like a journey through time itself. These corridors had witnessed centuries of secrets. Kings had walked here. Queens had wept here. Empires had risen and fallen within these walls, and the stone remembered everything. James's footsteps echoed in the silence, each step a drumbeat of reluctance and resolve. He passed portraits of monarchs long dead, their painted eyes seeming to follow him, judging him, asking him the question he was already asking himself. Are you truly doing this? Are you truly about to betray the trust of your position? But what choice did he have? In the military, there is no choice. There is only the mission. There is only the order. There is only duty. He reached the door. Tall carved oak, centuries old. The kind of door that has witnessed more history than most humans will ever read about. His hand, steady despite everything, inserted the key. The lock turned with a sound like bones cracking. The door opened. The room beyond was unexpected. James had imagined opulence, gold and velvet and crystal chandeliers. But what he found was restraint. Elegance, yes, but not extravagance. Soft morning light filtered through tall windows, illuminating a space that felt more like a sanctuary than a showpiece. Family photographs in simple frames, books stacked on a reading table, a writing desk with personal correspondence neatly arranged. This was not the room of a queen consort playing a role. This was the room of a woman living a life. And suddenly, James felt like an intruder in a way that went beyond duty. He was violating not just protocol, but humanity. Privacy, the basic dignity that every person, regardless of title, deserves. But the mission demanded he continue. The wardrobe stood against the far wall. Massive, dark mahogany. The kind of furniture that had probably been in this palace longer than James had been alive. He approached it slowly, reverently, as though approaching a bomb that might detonate at any moment. His fingers touched the handles. Brass, polished by generations of hands. He pulled. The doors swung open with a whisper. Inside, as expected, were garments. Dresses, coats, formal attire arranged with meticulous care. The scent of lavender and cedar drifted out, the smell of preservation, of respect for fine things. James began his search methodically, the way he'd been trained, checking pockets, feeling along seams, looking for anything unusual, anything out of place, anything that might be this mysterious item of historical importance that had supposedly been misplaced. Minutes passed. 5, 10, 15. Nothing. Then his hand brushed against something in the back. Hidden behind the everyday garments, behind the public facade, there was another section. Deeper, darker, protected. He pulled aside a heavy winter coat, and what he saw made his breath catch in his throat. A garment bag. But not just any garment bag. This one was old, preserved with a care that suggested sacred protection. The fabric was archival quality, the kind used for museum pieces, the kind used for items that must survive centuries. His hands, which had remained steady through everything up to this point, began to tremble. He shouldn't open it. Every instinct screamed at him to step back, to report what he'd found, to let someone else take responsibility for whatever came next. But the Lord Chamberlain had been clear. Find what we're looking for. And somehow James knew. He knew that this was it. The zipper made almost no sound. A professional closure, designed for silence, and as he parted the bag, revealing what lay within, James Thornhill, veteran of 23 years of service, man who'd stood watch in war zones and never flinched, felt tears spring unbidden to his eyes. It was a coronation robe, but not just any coronation robe. Even before he saw the monogram, even before his mind fully processed what he was looking at, his heart knew. This was Queen Elizabeth's coronation robe, the late queen, the monarch he'd served for most of his career, the woman whose death had brought the nation to its knees in grief just over a year ago. The fabric was exquisite, purple velvet, rich as a summer midnight. Ermine trim, white and black in perfect contrast. Gold embroidery that caught the light and seemed to glow with an inner fire. And there, stitched into the lining in thread so fine it was almost invisible, were the initials, E.R. Elizabeth Regina, James stood frozen, his mind racing through possibilities, through implications, through questions that had no easy answers. Why was the late Queen's coronation robe here, in Queen Camilla's private wardrobe, hidden away like a secret, like something that needed to be concealed? The obvious conclusion would be theft, impropriety, some scandal waiting to explode. But James had not survived 2 decades in service by jumping to obvious conclusions. He'd survived by observing, by thinking, by understanding that truth is rarely simple and almost never obvious. He examined the robe more carefully. It had been preserved with extraordinary care. No damage, no wear, no signs of disrespect or neglect. In fact, it had been maintained better than some items he'd seen in the royal collection. Someone had been taking care of this, not hiding it to possess it, but protecting it, preserving it. And then he noticed something else. Tucked into the garment bag, folded with reverent precision, was a letter. The paper was thick, expensive, personal stationery. He knew he shouldn't read it. This was already more violation than he could justify. But his hands moved anyway, unfolding the letter, his eyes scanning words written in elegant script. "My dearest Camilla," it began. And the handwriting. James would know that handwriting anywhere. Every guardsman learned to recognize the signatures of the royal family. This was Queen Elizabeth's hand. "I entrust this to you, not as a burden, but as a blessing. This robe carried me through the most important day of my public life, and I wish for it to serve one final purpose. When your time comes, when you stand where I once stood, I want you to know that you have my blessing. Not just the blessing of a monarch, but the blessing of a woman who understands the weight of the crown, the loneliness of duty, and the courage it takes to love someone the world doubts. Wear this beneath your own robe if you wish, or keep it close as a reminder that continuity matters more than pride, and family matters more than perfection. You are family now, you always were. With love and respect, Elizabeth R." The letter slipped from James's fingers, drifting to the floor like a falling leaf. The story he'd been prepared to uncover had just shifted entirely. This wasn't theft. This wasn't scandal. This was forgiveness, acceptance. A private moment of grace between 2 women who the world had spent decades forcing into opposition. Queen Elizabeth, in her final years, had given Queen Camilla her coronation robe, not as a public gesture, not as a political statement, but as a personal act of reconciliation, a bridge between past and future, a message that whatever the tabloids said, whatever the public believed, whatever history recorded, between them, there was peace. And now James understood why the Lord Chamberlain had sent him here, why the urgency, why the secrecy. This letter, this robe, this gesture of private grace. If it became public in the wrong way, it would be twisted, analyzed, weaponized. The press would tear it apart looking for hidden meanings, for controversy, for division. They would never understand that sometimes the most powerful moments are the quiet ones, the private ones, the ones that happen between 2 people when the cameras are off and the crown is just a weight they both understand. But someone had found out. Someone had asked questions, and now the palace was in crisis mode, trying to contain a story that wasn't actually scandalous at all, except that in the world of royal protocol, privacy is scandal. Humanity is scandal. Anything that reveals that beneath the crowns and the ceremonies and the ancient traditions, these are just people trying to navigate impossible circumstances with grace and dignity. That's the biggest scandal of all. James carefully refolded the letter. He placed it back in the garment bag exactly as he'd found it. He zipped the bag closed with reverent care. And then he stood there in the private chamber of the Queen Consort, a working-class soldier who'd been given a glimpse behind the curtain, and he made a decision. When he returned to the Lord Chamberlain's office, Sir Michael looked up with anxious eyes. "Well, did you find it?" "Yes, sir," James replied, his voice steady. "I found the late Queen's coronation robe. It's been preserved with extraordinary care. Archival quality storage. Perfect condition. No damage whatsoever. And? Sir Michael leaned forward. Was there anything else? Any indication of how it came to be there? James met his superior's gaze directly. Nothing unusual, sir. It appears to be part of the royal collection, properly stored and maintained. I found no evidence of impropriety. It was the truth. Just not all of it. The letter existed, yes, but James had decided in that moment that some truths were meant to remain private. Queen Elizabeth had given Camilla that robe in confidence with love, with the understanding that it would remain between them. And James would honor that, not because he was disobeying orders, but because sometimes the highest form of duty is knowing what to protect and what to reveal. Sir Michael studied him for a long moment. The old man was no fool. He'd served long enough to recognize when someone was choosing their words carefully, but he was also wise enough to recognize when a soldier was making the right choice, even if it wasn't the expected one. I see, Sir Michael said finally. And in your professional opinion, as someone who served the crown for over 2 decades, is there any security concern regarding this item? None whatsoever, sir. The robe is secure, properly maintained, and poses no risk to the crown or the royal family. In fact, I'd say it's exactly where it should be. A ghost of a smile touched Sir Michael's lips. Very good, Sergeant. Your discretion in this matter is noted and appreciated. You're dismissed. James saluted, turned, and walked out. But as he made his way back through those ancient corridors, past those painted monarchs with their judging eyes, he felt something he hadn't expected to feel. Pride, not the pride of accomplishment, but the deeper pride of having done the right thing in a moment when right and wrong weren't clearly marked. In the days that followed, there were whispers, palace staff asking questions, journalists sniffing around for a story that didn't exist. But the official line was simple. A routine security audit had been conducted, all items of historical significance were accounted for, and there was no story to tell. And gradually, mercifully, the interest faded. But for James Thornhill, the story was far from over. Because in that wardrobe, in that letter, in that gesture of private grace between 2 queens, he'd learned something about duty that 23 years of service hadn't taught him. He'd learned that sometimes the most important thing a soldier can protect isn't a building or a person, or even a crown. Sometimes the most important thing to protect is dignity, privacy, the basic human right to have moments that aren't dissected, analyzed, and judged by a world that thinks it's entitled to know everything. Queen Elizabeth had understood that. In her final years, she'd reached out to the woman who would walk in her shadow, and she'd offered not just a robe, but reconciliation, understanding, a message that said, I know what this costs. I know what you'll face, and I want you to know that you have my respect. And Queen Camilla had received that gift with the reverence it deserved, not flaunting it, not publicizing it, but keeping it close as a reminder that she was part of a continuity larger than herself. Months later, James would watch Queen Camilla's coronation on television, along with millions of others around the world. He would see her crowned, robed in purple and gold, standing where Elizabeth had once stood. And though he couldn't see beneath that robe, he wondered if she'd followed Elizabeth's suggestion. He wondered if, hidden from view, she was carrying that piece of history close to her heart, a secret connection between past and present, a private act of honor that the world would never know about. And that was exactly as it should be. Because here's what James had learned, what that morning in the wardrobe had taught him about respect and duty and honor. Not everything that's important needs to be seen. Not everything that's true needs to be told. And sometimes the greatest act of loyalty is knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. The world wants transparency. The media demands access. The public feels entitled to every detail, every private moment, every personal exchange. But there's a difference between the right to know and the right to understand. Some things are meant to be private not because they're scandalous, but because they're sacred. Some exchanges between people are meant to remain between those people because their power lies in their intimacy, not their publicity. Queen Elizabeth gave Camilla that robe as a gift of acceptance. Camilla received it with gratitude and grace. And James Thornhill protected them both by understanding that his duty wasn't to expose truth, but to safeguard dignity. This is what discipline really means. Not blind obedience, not following orders without thought, but having the wisdom to understand what truly matters and the courage to protect it even when doing so goes against expectation. James could have reported everything he found. He could have given Sir Michael that letter. He could have let the palace machinery decide what to do with information that would inevitably leak, that would inevitably become a headline, that would inevitably be twisted into something it wasn't. But he chose silence. And in that silence, he honored not just two queens but the very concept of respect itself. Respect means recognizing that other people's private moments are just that. Private. Respect means understanding that not every truth serves the public good. Respect means knowing that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all. In the military, they teach you to stand post, to maintain your position no matter what, to be a wall between threat and safety. Most people think that means physical threat. But James learned that day that sometimes the threat isn't a person with a weapon. Sometimes the threat is exposure, invasion, the violation of basic human dignity in the name of public interest. And he'd stood his post. Years from now, when James looks back on his career, he knows that mourning in the wardrobe will stand out. Not the ceremonies he participated in, not the dignitaries he guarded, not the medals he earned, but that quiet morning when he was forced to choose between the letter of the law and the spirit of respect. And he chose respect. He thinks about that letter sometimes. The handwriting, the words, the image of an elderly queen, at the end of her historic reign, taking the time to write to the woman who'd been vilified, criticized, and judged for decades, taking the time to say, "I see you, I understand you, and you have my blessing." That's leadership. That's grace. That's the kind of humanity that crowns were meant to protect, not suppress. And he thinks about Queen Camilla receiving that gift, understanding its weight and choosing to keep it private, not using it for publicity, not wielding it as a weapon against critics, just keeping it close. A private reassurance in a very public life. That's dignity. That's character. That's the quiet strength that doesn't need validation from strangers. We live in an age of exposure. Everything must be shared, posted, broadcast, analyzed. Privacy is treated as suspicious. Secrets are automatically assumed to be scandalous. But what James witnessed that morning wasn't scandal. It was the opposite of scandal. It was two women separated by age and circumstance and public perception, finding a moment of connection in a gesture of extraordinary kindness. And it was a soldier, trained to follow orders, choosing to protect that moment instead of exposing it. Because some things matter more than obedience. Some things matter more than protocol. Some things matter more than the public's perceived right to know. And at the top of that list is the basic human dignity that every person, regardless of title or position, deserves. This is the lesson James carried forward. This is what he would tell young guardsmen coming up through the ranks. That duty isn't just about following orders. It's about understanding why those orders exist. It's about protecting what truly matters. It's about having the wisdom to distinguish between secrets that need to be exposed and truths that need to be protected. The Royal Guard stands at the gates not just to keep threats out, but to keep sanctuaries safe. And sometimes those sanctuaries aren't buildings. Sometimes they're moments, connections, private exchanges between people who live most of their lives under scrutiny and deserve to have something, anything, that remains theirs alone. When James retired from service 3 years later, there was a small ceremony. His commanding officer praised his dedication. His fellow guardsmen saluted his commitment, and at the end, there was a private moment with Sir Michael, who shook his hand and said simply, "You were exactly the man we needed for exactly the right moment. Thank you for your service." And James understood that the thanks wasn't just for his years in uniform. It was for that morning, that choice, that moment of wisdom when he'd protected something more valuable than security. He'd protected humanity. So what can we learn from this story? What does it teach us about respect, about duty, about the choices we make when no one is watching. It teaches us that honor isn't always loud. It's not always public. Sometimes honor is a quiet decision made in a private moment. Sometimes honor is choosing silence over exposure. Sometimes honor is understanding that other people's dignity matters more than your own sense of righteousness. We live in a world that rewards whistleblowers and celebrates those who expose secrets. And sometimes that's necessary. Sometimes corruption needs to be revealed. Sometimes wrongdoing needs to be addressed. But not every secret is corruption. Not every private moment is scandal. And having the wisdom to know the difference, and that's true discipline, that's real strength. Sergeant James Thornhill forced open a wardrobe and discovered a truth that could have become a scandal. But instead of exposing it, he protected it. Not because he was covering up wrongdoing, but because he understood that what he'd found was the opposite of wrongdoing. It was a moment of grace, preserved in silk and velvet, meant for only two people. And he honored that by keeping it exactly where it belonged. Hidden, private, sacred. That's the kind of soldier we should all aspire to be. Not the kind who blindly follows every order, but the kind who understands the deeper purpose behind duty. The kind who knows that sometimes the greatest act of service is knowing when to step back, stay silent, and let people have their humanity. Because at the end of the day, beneath all the uniforms and protocols and ancient traditions, we're all just people. Trying to do our best. Trying to find moments of connection in a world that constantly demands we perform. And when we're lucky enough to witness those moments, the highest honor is not to exploit them, but to protect them. The late Queen's coronation robe still rests in that wardrobe, a symbol of continuity, a bridge between generations, a private gift given with love and kept with respect. And somewhere, a retired sergeant carries the memory of the day he was entrusted with that secret and chose to do the right thing, even when the right thing meant doing nothing at all. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think differently about duty, respect, and the power of knowing when to speak and when to stay silent, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever been in a position where you had to choose between exposure and discretion? What did you do? And if you want more stories about honor, discipline, and the moments that define us, subscribe to the channel. Because there are more stories like this. Stories about ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, making choices that reveal what character truly means. Until next time, remember, the strongest walls are often the silent ones, and the greatest respect we can show another person is understanding that not everything needs to be shared to be real.